Hey there, or welcome for the very first time. You re-listening to Boring History for Sleep, where we drift into the quieter corners of the past, with no rush, no drama, and no need to stay awake. Tonight, we'll slip into a world that looked tidy from the outside, but behind those stiff collars and corseted silhouettes, hygiene in Victorian times was often more complicated and more surprising than you might think. We won't focus on the worst of it. Instead, we'll gently walk through the routines of washing, dressing, brushing, scrubbing, laundering, and more. How did Victorians bathe without plumbing? Why did they fear soap? What was dry cleaning? How did hospitals smell? And why did people carry vinegar-soaked sponges in public? One long, slow exhale into a different time. So settle in, take a breath, and let's step quietly into a world lit by gas lamps, where cleanliness was a daily struggle and a deeply personal ritual. Imagine it's early morning. The year is 1856, and somewhere in a modest London townhouse, on the second floor, just past the creaky landing, a bedroom begins to stir. But there is no alarm, only the faint chime of a nearby church bell, and the muffled sound of cartwheels outside on cobbled streets. A servant has already passed through once, tending the fireplace, bringing in coal, and setting down a pitcher of lukewarm water beside a ceramic wash basin. There was no running water, no porcelain sink with flowing taps, no hot steam rising from a tiled shower. Instead, there was a ritual. Quiet. You pull back the counterpane, and the morning chill brushes your arms. The room is cool, perhaps even cold. Windows in the Victorian era were often drafty, and central heating was a luxury beyond most. Still, the coals are crackling faintly now, and beside the bed, on a small wooden stand, sits the washstand, usually made from dark oak, with a little shelf for folded cloths and a drawer to hold brushes and combs. On top of it, filled just moments ago with warmed water from the kitchen hearth. You dip your hands into the basin. The water is slightly tepid, not hot. Hot water required fuel. Fuel cost money, and many households saved it for the main wash of the week. Still, it's clean, clear, and for the moment, enough. You lift the flannel cloth from the washstand's corner. It's slightly stiff from repeated use and drying by the fire, but it softens as it soaks. Victorians didn't bathe each day, not in the way we understand bathing. Instead, they relied on the strip wash. Each morning, the process was known as a good tidy, and for many, it was all the water they'd use until evening. The water from the jug would be poured, little by little, into the basin, just enough to wet the cloth. You'd wash your face first, gently dabbing at the eyes, the cheeks, the forehead, then the neck, then your hands. There was no soap at this stage. Soap, especially good soap, was still relatively expensive, and many were wary of overusing it. Too much washing, it was thought, could weaken the skin. The flannel was wrung out carefully. The used water would eventually be taken out by a maid or emptied into a slop pail. But for now, it sat. A little clouded, but still useful if more washing was needed. You might now reach for a hairbrush, stiff but reliable. Hair was rarely washed more than once a week, so brushing it each morning was part of keeping it healthy, a way to distribute the natural oils to remove dust and keep it neat. For wealthier households, a splash of scent on the wrists or dabbed behind the ears, not to impress anyone necessarily, but simply to feel refreshed. You open the shutters slowly. Outside, chimney smoke begins to rise. A milk cart passes, and the day begins in earnest. But within these walls, the act of washing, quiet, simple, minimal, has marked the transition from rest to waking. There's something grounding in the gentleness of it. The stillness, the lack of rush, but there was intention, a slow rhythm to each motion, because it was precious. The wash basin, topped up with fresh water, or perhaps still half full, depending on the household. It wasn't glamorous, but it was routine, and in routine, there's comfort. Let's return now. A Victorian bedroom, where the porcelain basin still holds a shallow pool of cooling water. You've already washed your face and hands. The air is still, the fire in the hearth crackling low. Now comes the rest of the morning cleansing ritual. Not with showers or hot jets of water, but with time, with method, and with what the Victorians called dry wash techniques. There was no such thing as a shower for most, not even for the wealthy. A true bath was a weekly, or sometimes monthly, event. But that didn't mean people ignored cleanliness. Instead, they turned to what they could do every day with limited resources and a strong desire to stay presentable. It starts with something that might seem unfamiliar today. Stiff-bristled, made from horsehair or boar bristle, and sometimes mounted on wood carved by hand. This brush wasn't used in water. It was used dry. The ritual of dry brushing, and encourage what they call circulation of the humours. You'd stand beside your washstand in your long cotton undergarments or linen shift, long sweeping motions along the arms, firm circular scrubs at the shoulders, down the legs, the thighs, over the back. If you could reach, the sensation was invigorating. And while the Victorians didn't understand the microbiology of skin, pores, they thought, opened and closed. With the weather, with mood, with diet, and most importantly, with exposure to air. And so brushing was believed to clean you, not just physically, but morally. Salt, a staple in the kitchen, but also a cornerstone of early Victorian hygiene. Before the widespread use of commercial soap, people relied on coarse salt scrubs to exfoliate, to draw out sweat. You might see a basin set with not just a jug of water, but a small bowl of coarse sea salt, sometimes infused with lavender or rosemary for scent. The salt would be dampened slightly, then rubbed across the arms and shoulders. It left the skin red. Vinegar was everywhere in the Victorian home, for cooking, preserving, cleaning, and cleansing the body. Some mixed vinegar with warm water for a morning sponge. Others soaked cloths in vinegar to rub under the arms. There were even preparations known as vinegar deodorants, sold in small bottles. The effect was sharp, acidic, but it masked body odor. in a world where sweat was constant and fragrance was social armor. You can imagine now. Then lifting a small cloth, wrung with rose vinegar, and gently dabbing under each arm. Not out of vanity, but from the quiet, constant effort to remain acceptable. The feet, often ignored in history, were given surprising attention in the Victorian routine. Shoes were stiff, heavy, and worn all day. Socks were rarely washed more than once a week. So each morning, many took a moment to soak their feet, even if the rest of their body would not see water. A small foot bath, a basin separate from the washstand. Inside, warm water, a few drops of vinegar or camphor oil, and, if affordable, a spoonful of bicarbonate soda, what we call baking soda today, to soften calluses and reduce odor. Hands, too, were given special care, especially for women. Nails were scrubbed with small brushes. Lemon juice was used to whiten the nail beds, and many rubbed glycerin or lanolin into their palms each morning. Natural moisturizers that kept the skin from cracking in the cold. There is something peaceful in these slow, just the hush of the morning, and a daily devotion to detail. Victorians often defined cleanliness, not by absence of germs, a concept they didn't fully understand, but by the presence of scent. To smell of lavender, rose, or violet was to prove yourself orderly, disciplined, pure. So the morning ended, often, with a final touch. A scented oil, or a few drops of toilet water, a kind of weak perfume, dabbed onto a handkerchief, or the skin behind the ears, tied with soft ribbon. The day begins again. Your hair is pinned, your dress buttoned, your boots laced. But under it all, there is that quiet ritual. The brush, the oil. But in a world without shampoo bottles, it was everything. And so ends this part of the morning. One moment of calm before stepping into a noisy world. In the Victorian era, dental care was both familiar and strange. Familiar in its goals. Fresh breath. Strange, perhaps, in its tools and methods. There were no electric toothbrushes, no whitening strips, no plastic tubes of minty paste. Instead, dental care was improvised, made at home, bought in packets or powders, learnt by habit, passed down quietly from parent to child. Imagine yourself standing once more at the washstand. The bowl has been emptied and refilled. The air smells faintly of vinegar, of lavender water, of something chalky and clean. On the side shelf sits a small box, no larger than your palm. Inside, this is tooth powder, and it is the center of Victorian oral hygiene. To clean one's teeth, you would begin by moistening your toothbrush, but carved wood or bone with bristles made from natural hair, often boar, horse, or badger. The bristles are stiff, splayed at the edges. You dip them into the powder. Brushing was done slowly. Front teeth, back teeth, molars, and gums. The powder would foam slightly. Only a faint taste of chalk or clove, not just for its sharp, numbing sensation, but for its antiseptic qualities. A drop placed on a sore tooth, a dab pressed against the gum. The taste was strong, but comforting. It was also used as a breath freshener. A single clove held in the cheek, or a tincture swirled with water. Others made their own toothpastes, a mixture of baking soda, crushed, sometimes even brick dust. Yet in many homes, especially those without regular access to a chemist, these mixtures were all that could be found. Tongue scraping, though rarely discussed in modern accounts, was another part of the ritual, using a rounded spoon or a specially shaped metal strip. The Victorians would gently clean the surface of the tongue. It was believed to remove decay and to purify the mouth. Quiet, private, quick, but done nonetheless. Mouthwashes also existed, but not as clear liquids with mint labels. There were herbal infusions, clove water, myrrh tincture, warm water mixed with vinegar and honey. These were swished gently, not for sparkle, but for relief. A sore gum, a loosened tooth, a minor infection. There were no dentists on every corner. Care had to begin at home, and when pain did come, and it did, remedies were close at hand. A hot compress of chamomile. Toothaches were a part of life, and for those who could not afford a dentist, but some did seek out dental professionals. In wealthier households, appointments might be made with a surgeon, often working from a room attached to an apothecary. These professionals advertised their services discreetly. Teeth extracted with minimal pain, or artificial teeth fitted upon gold plate. The fittings were rudimentary by modern standards. False teeth, clean white teeth, even if artificial, marked the bearer as refined, and so people cared for them. Soaked them in vinegar or spirits overnight, brushed them with gentle powders, wrapped them in cloth. Quiet companions to a quiet life. Children, mothers might teach them to rub their teeth with a clean cloth or to chew a stick of licorice root, sweet, slightly abrasive, and satisfying to the senses. Not candy. By the window now, the light grows stronger. The day outside is fully alive, but here, within the quiet walls of a Victorian home, the morning mouth is clean, the powder brushed away, the bristles rinsed and placed back on the shelf, the clove tucked into the corner of the mouth for freshness. Cleanliness, once again, has been achieved, not by our standards perhaps, but by theirs, attentive, deliberate, and sincere. Imagine now that the brushing is done, the basin water has cooled, and the air in the room has warmed just slightly from the low, crackling fire. Outside, you can hear the occasional soft clop of a horse-drawn cart. Inside, the quiet morning rhythm continues, and turns now to the hair. In the Victorian world, it was a slow, daily ritual, a task shaped by patience, by texture, by expectation, and perhaps, more than anything, by what was available. Shampoo, as we know it today, didn't exist. Instead, the care of one's hair was rooted in brushing, oiling, scenting, and restraint. You might picture a woman seated in front of a mirror, though not for vanity. The glass is likely small, cloudy at the corners. Upon the dressing table lie 2 combs, one wide-toothed, one fine, and a brush. Not a plastic one, but something more tactile. The bristles are natural, often boar's hair, fixed into a carved wooden back, smoothed from years of use. And nearby, a small bottle of oil almond. Hair was rarely washed, more than once a week, and often less. In some cases, perhaps only once a month. This wasn't laziness. It was practicality. Washing hair was a full event. Water had to be heated by the kettle, carried in buckets, tested for temperature, and applied without running taps or showers, then rinsed, again and again with jugs of clean water. It was wet, cold, heavy, and inconvenient, and so they relied on other methods. Each morning, the hair would be brushed, slowly, from root to end, not for show, but to carry the natural oils from scalp to tip. Brushing was cleaning. It was distributing, softening, preserving. For men, the practice was similar, though perhaps shorter. A quick comb through. For women, the ritual could last 20 minutes or longer, and it wasn't done in silence. A mother might brush her daughter's hair. A maid might help her mistress untangle the lengths that had been braided for sleep, or someone might simply brush her own by the fire with no one watching. The brush catching on knots, the sound soft and rhythmic. If the scalp became itchy, a spoonful of vinegar with rose water. It was sharp but soothing, and it kept the head feeling fresh between those rare washes. Some used powders, chalk, starch, or powdered orris root to soak up oil, applied at the crown, combed out carefully. This practice, in essence, was an early form of dry shampoo to perfume the hair. Ribbons or combs were sometimes dipped in scented oils. You wouldn't always apply it directly. Instead, you let it linger. A lavender sachet kept near the brush, a few drops of rosemary water added to the rinse. If one was lucky enough to have herbs on hand, perfume was not sprayed. It was allowed to settle, to hover. On hair washing day, towels were laid out, not fluffy and soft. A basin was filled. The hair would be dunked, section by section, carefully squeezed, never wrung. The rinse was perhaps a vinegar-water mix to restore shine. And afterward, the drying process began. Hair was not blown dry. It was wrapped in cloth. Men too. Many applied waxes, oils, and tonics. Some sold with extravagant claims. Hair loss was a constant worry. So they rubbed in bear grease, eventually. But above all, hair was maintained not by removing oil, but by managing it, controlled. The smell of soap was not expected. The absence of odor or the presence of flowers and herbs was preferred. Wigs were rare by this time, but not unknown. Hairpieces were more common, especially for women aging or recovering from illness. These were carefully brushed. A woman might have only one or two in a lifetime. They were expensive, often reused from another. Lice, though not often mentioned, remedies existed. Combs with fine metal teeth, lavender, sachets. The struggle was quiet, consistent, and never entirely won. But the routine, the brushing, the oiling, the slow unwinding, gave a rhythm to the day. Something personal. Something to do each morning before the world intruded. And if your hair was long, it was braided for sleep, tied with soft ribbon, wrapped loosely in cloth. The day begins again. Your hair is pinned. There is that quiet ritual, the brush, the care. It may not seem like much, but in a world without shampoo bottles, blow dryers, or conditioners, it was everything. You've brushed your hair. The scent of lavender, the fire has settled into a gentle glow, but the morning ritual is not yet finished. There is still one more act of care, often the most intimate. In the quiet space of a Victorian morning, not rushed, not artificial, not masked behind artificial flavors, but deliberate, modest, grounded in habit and homemade simplicity, you might begin with the toothbrush, a wooden handle, bristles made not of nylon or silicone, but stiff animal hair, usually boar or horse. Others were softened slightly with time. There was no toothpaste in a tube. Instead, tooth powder, dry, chalky, sometimes mixed with soot, salt, or ground charcoal. It had a distinct, earthy smell, not unpleasant, but different. Sometimes a faint whiff of mint, if such luxury was available. Often the scent of crushed herbs, perhaps sage, perhaps cloves. You would wet the brush in a small bowl of water, then dab it gently into the powder. Not too much, just enough to coat the bristles. The brushing itself was calm, no buzzing, no timers, no foamy lather. Just short strokes, front teeth first, then the molars, then gently across the gums. The taste was subtle. There might be a soft grit beneath the tongue, but this was familiar, comforting. Nor you, comforting. The act itself, rather than the outcome, was what mattered. Some rubbed the powder directly on with a fingertip, others used cloth. A small square of linen, it was enough. Tongue cleaning, while rarely discussed today, a thin piece of metal. No force, no urgency, just a slow pull, repeated. Some households used a clean spoon. Others skipped it. But where it was done with the same careful consistency as everything else. Breath was important. Even when few spoke of it openly, mouth rinses followed. Not blue liquids from plastic bottles, but warm water infused with herbs or vinegar. Clove water was common, as was myrrh when available. Sage, steeped in boiled water, created a bitter rinse, often recommended by household guides. These were not to mask, but to soothe, to cleanse gently. Sometimes a single drop of peppermint oil was added to a teacup of water and swished with quiet appreciation. If there was tooth pain, and there often was, remedies were at hand, passed down like heirlooms. A clove pressed gently between the cheek and gum could dull an ache. A rinse of salt water, a poultice of mashed garlic and mustard might be applied in desperate times. For those who had access, unceremonious and rarely spoken of again. But most Victorians hoped to avoid such moments. They took their oral care seriously. Teeth were seen as markers of discipline. And so families brushed together in the morning light. Parents instructed children with care. Not too hard on the gums. Mind the corners. rinse when you're done. These lessons were quiet, repeated often, and embedded in the rhythm of the day. False teeth, too, were part of life, not always due to vanity. For those with means, a full set, cleaned with a gentle vinegar rinse. At night, they would be removed with care, examined, cleaned again, and laid beside the bed, not hidden but tended to, like any other precious item of what had been lost. Children's teeth were less carefully watched. Many families used soft cloths to clean them. A piece of bread crust might be chewed in the morning to scrub the teeth naturally. Sweets were limited, not for health alone, but for cost. Sugar, when affordable, was rationed carefully. The decay it caused was known. Dentistry. Others worked from their homes. Their tools were simple. Metal forceps, oil lamps, padded chairs. Pain relief was minimal, yet some still went, dressed in their best coats, to sit beneath frosted windows, while their teeth were examined by gaslight. The bravery of this was never loudly acknowledged, but quietly admired. In that quiet room, in front of the washstand, with the sun rising slowly and the fire whispering low, the powder is returned to its tin, the brush is rinsed and laid flat, a drop of lavender on the wrist, and the day moves on. There is no sparkle, no whitening strips, but there is care, consistency. Even if that world is only a walk down the street, a visit to the grocer, you breathe in now, deeper, slower. The teeth are clean as they could be. The mouth freshened, not by menthol. There is no rush. Only the hush of history, the rhythm of the past. The fire has burned a little longer now. Its warmth settles low in the room. The daylight outside is softer, filtered through soot-dusted windows. And the body, though brushed and tended to each morning, eventually calls for more than a cloth and a bowl. It calls for water, warm, enveloping, cleansing. But in the Victorian home, a bath was not a daily indulgence. It was a laborious act, a weekly commitment, a ritual that involved not only the body, but the entire household. You might imagine the setting. A modest home, perhaps in a town or on the edge of the countryside. The parlor, which by day is a place for receiving visitors, is now transformed. Furniture is pushed gently aside. A rug rolled up and laid carefully in the corner, and into the center of the room, before the hearth, where the fire glows low and slow, is drawn the bathtub, but tin or galvanized metal, rounded at the edges, heavy and cool to the touch, carried in from where it usually hangs in the scullery or leans behind the pantry door. It is set before the flames, as close as one dares, and the floor beneath is protected by towels, if there are any to spare. The water does not come from a tap. It is heated on the stove, kettle by kettle. Each is carried carefully. The process takes time, perhaps half an hour, perhaps more. Water must be replenished and reheated throughout. It is a task of effort. Soap, if it is available, often handmade. Lye-based, coarse, scented, faintly, with carbolic or lavender. It may sting if the skin is cracked. It may not lather much, but it is valued. A rough cloth, called a flannel, is folded beside it. There are no loofahs, no plastic sponges, just the cloth and the hands. And so, when the tub is ready, too hot in places, too cool in others, you ease yourself in, limb by limb. First the feet, then the knees, then the rest. The tin is unforgiving. It retains the chill of the room, but the water, at least for a while, is comfort enough. Washing is brief, quick and careful. Soap is applied where needed. Hair, if it is to be washed, and often it is not, is done last. Leaned back awkwardly, a pitcher of clean water poured gently, cautiously, to avoid the eyes. It is a quiet procedure. No running taps, no steam filling the room, just the pop of the fire, if one is lucky, but more often it is shared. The same water reused in order of seniority. Father first, then mother, then the children, one by one. The water cools. The soap fades by the end, but it is still used, because it must be. In wealthier homes, there may be a bathroom set aside. The water is still carried by hand. The servants heat it. A gentleman might sit for longer, but even here, it is a weekly act, sometimes less. To bathe too often, even dangerous. There were fears, too, not entirely unfounded for the time. That water might open the pores too far, that it might allow in illness, that too much soaking weakened the spirit, especially in women. Physicians wrote articles on the dangers of cold baths, on the risks of overexposure. Cleanliness, they advised, should be maintained through moderation, through wiping and brushing rather than soaking. But for most, a weekly bath was a luxury, and it was respected as such. It marked time. It offered relief. It was, for many, the only time the body was fully exposed. The moment that followed, quieter still. Afterward, the tub was emptied, the water, ladled out if there was no drain, carried away in buckets. The tub was wiped clean, dried, returned to its place. The towels, stiff and damp, were hung to dry. The room was aired out, the rug unrolled, the chairs put back into place, and that was it. 1 hour, once a week, a bath taken not with ease. This, then, is how cleanliness was achieved, not through frequency, but through reverence. The bath was not casual, and through that effort, a sense of quiet pride. Now the fire is lower, the tub is gone, but its memory lingers in the warmth of the skin, the softness of the hands, the simple feeling of being clean. Let that be enough. Let it settle in your thoughts. Let it drift softly across your mind. The home bath, rare and private, was only one piece of the Victorian story of cleanliness. There was another path to water, one shared, one structured. For many, especially in cities where rooms were small and plumbing non-existent, bathing meant stepping outside one's home and into a space where water was communal. It meant the public bathhouse. These bathhouses were not like Roman spas or Turkish hammams. Though echoes of both lingered in the imagination, the Victorian bathhouse was more restrained, often brick buildings tucked between terraced houses or behind factories. Unassuming, you might picture one now, The entrance is narrow. Inside, the fee is modest. A few pennies, but not insignificant. For many families, it was a decision weighed carefully each week. Once paid, you're shown to a small room. Simple, tiled if you're lucky, or perhaps just plastered and whitewashed. In the center, no hot and cold taps to twist. Instead, an attendant arrives shortly after, carrying buckets of water, some heated by furnace, others cool from the sink. He pours them into the bath. Then, with a nod and a closed door, you're left alone. It is not glamorous. It is not luxurious. It is warm. And for a brief time, it is yours. In the larger bathhouses, there were even separate areas. First class and second class, depending on what one could afford. First class baths. Second class baths were more crowded, louder. The water reused more often, but they served their purpose. And across both classes, there was a shared understanding that to be clean was to be respectable. To step out into the world with hair brushed, a mark of diligence, especially for the working poor, whose lives were hard and whose labor was constant. These public baths offered something more than sanitation. They offered a moment of pause, of care, of dignity. For women, privacy was harder to come by, and so many women bathed at home with cloth and bowl, or not at all. But others found refuge in certain hours set aside for ladies only. They brought their children, their sisters. They helped one another scrub and rinse, and for a time, behind closed doors, they could tend to themselves without judgment. In seaside towns, another kind of bathing emerged, one more curious. These were not machines in the modern sense. They were wooden carts, tall and narrow, with steps inside and curtains for privacy. Drawn by horses, they rolled from the beach down into the surf. A bather would climb inside. The cart would be pulled into the water, often with the help of a bathing attendant. It was a spectacle of modesty. The machines allowed a person to engage with the water, to feel the salt and the chill, the pull of the waves, without compromising their decorum. It was as much ritual as recreation. For men, they might bathe in groups, especially in rivers or along the docks. But even here, certain hours were enforced. And as the 19th century wore on, propriety became even more carefully policed. Cleanliness, once a personal endeavor, had become increasingly social, bound by rules, watched by neighbors, measured not just by scent, but by reputation. In the heart of cities like London, Glasgow, or Manchester, more modern bathhouses began to appear, funded by reformers who believed that public health began with personal hygiene. These were brick and tile institutions. Some even had steam rooms, modelled on ancient designs, but the mood was always restrained. These spaces, while austere, were deeply significant. They allowed labourers to arrive at work freshly scrubbed. They gave children their first taste of warm water on chilled skin. They let elderly women feel, if only for a moment, renewed. And when the bath was finished, you would dress again, buttoned from neck to ankle. You might walk home through crowded alleys or quiet streets, but inside, beneath layers of wool and linen, you carried the soft glow of cleanliness. It didn't last long. Not in the smog, not in the soot, but for a little while, it was enough. The public bath was not glamorous. It was not meant to be, but it was a point of pride. And for many, now imagine that warm air turning cool, the wet towel folded once more, the tub emptied, the coins paid, the shoes tied. You step out into the late afternoon light, a little cleaner, and in that sensation, let it rest in your thoughts for now. The water, the steam, the body may be clean for now, skin scrubbed, hair brushed, mouth rinsed. But in the Victorian world, cleanliness, the linens against the skin, the garments layered one over the other. In a world where the air was often thick with soot, and the streets carried the grime of horses, carts, and coal smoke, clothing became both barrier and burden. And so came laundry. Not the push of a button, but a day-long task that began with heat, with water, with silence, and almost always with a Monday. Laundry day was as fixed in the rhythm of the week as church on Sunday. It began at dawn, perhaps earlier, and it began not in the washroom, but at the hearth. Fires had to be built and sustained. Kettles filled, coal fetched, kindling laid carefully to avoid smoking up the room, water, cold and still from the yard, pump or indoor basin, had to be brought in by the bucket. In wealthier homes, a dedicated laundry room might be set apart, stone-floored. The hearth was the stove, clothes were sorted the night before, whites, colours, delegates, heavy linens, some marked with initials, others mended but worn. The first boil was always for the whites. A large copper cauldron, into it went the shirts. These were not washed often. Soap, if available, was grated from a block. Yellow soap, lye-based, sharp and alkaline. It foamed little, but cleaned deeply. Sometimes soda crystals or washing powder were added, though in poorer households, the same soap was used for clothes, hands, and hair. Boiling took time. You didn't stir with bare hands, but with a stick or long wooden paddle. The clothes bobbed gently like ghosts. Steam rose, clinging to the ceiling, loosening the wallpaper, softening the edges of the room. Then came scrubbing, before machines. Scrubbing meant the board, ribbed, wooden, worn smooth at the edges. A bar of soap was rubbed directly onto the cloth, then the cloth onto the board. Hands, red, rinse water was separate and had to be fetched again. Each garment might be scrubbed, wrung out, and rinsed 3 times. There were no shortcuts. Delicate items, lace collars, petticoats, christening gowns, were treated more gently, soaked overnight in starch water or soda. They were pressed and blotted, never scrubbed. Some women kept small brushes just for lace. Others placed the most fragile items inside muslin bags to protect them. Even the act of washing could damage them. Once cleaned, the clothes were wrung by hand, turned slowly with a handle. Mangling was hard work. It required weight, rhythm, care not to trap fingers or twist seams, but it was faster than wringing by hand, and every minute saved was precious. Drying came next. On clear days, pegs carved from wood, clothes flapped slowly, heavy with rinsed water, until they lightened in the wind. But most days were not dry. Most were damp or and so clothes were draped indoors, across chairs, banisters, iron racks placed near the fire. The drying took hours, sometimes days, and during that time, the house smelled not of food or flowers, but of damp cotton, soap, and steam. Not unpleasant. Irons were solid metal, heated on the stove. They cooled quickly and were swapped out often. You could test the heat by holding the iron near your cheek or spitting lightly to hear the hiss. A cloth was laid down first. Each crease, a spray of water might be used to ease wrinkles, or vinegar for stubborn folds. By evening, the work was not finished, but paused. Clothes were folded, others laid across beds to be sorted in the morning. The back ached, but the smell of clean linen, faintly soapy, touched by smoke, offered quiet satisfaction. In large households, laundry was done by staff, laundresses, washerwomen. Their days were longer still. They carried wet loads up and down stairs, worked in cold water in winter, scraped at stains with bread crusts or lemon juice, yet their efforts were invisible. For the poorest, laundry was done at public washhouses when such existed. There, rows of stone sinks, iron boilers, and wringers waited. Women washed side by side, children underfoot. Soap was shared, news exchanged, the sound of water slapping cloth, irons scraping boards, laughter and murmurs. The work was hard, but it was shared. And in all these settings, it was decency, preparedness, a sense of order in a world that was often anything but. By the end of laundry day, there was no energy for much else. Supper was simple. The fire burned low, clothes hung like shadows in the corners of the room. And the next morning, when you dressed, the fabric against your skin was still slightly stiff, still carrying the scent of yesterday's steam. And you, someone, perhaps you, had labored for that comfort. Let that thought rest now. The boil of water, the scrape of the board, the long, slow drying of clean cotton. Let it sink into quietness. Let it carry you further into calm. The washing is done now. The basin emptied. The laundry dried and folded. The air in the home has begun to still again. Less steam, fewer footsteps, more softness. But for Victorians, there was a final layer, one more gentle than boiling linens or scrubbing skin. It came not with effort. This was the layer of fragrance, of powders, perfumes, and the careful masking of the body's natural scent. In a world without daily showers, scent became an art, and more than that, a form of social language. To smell of coal smoke or factory oil was a marker of class and circumstance. To smell of lavender, rose water, or even faintly of lemon, that was an indication of care, of restraint, of respectability. But perfumes were not for everyone. The most expensive fragrances imported from Paris, bottled in glass with delicate stoppers, nobility and the very wealthy. These might contain exotic ingredients, essence of neroli, ambergris, or true attar of roses. They were worn in small dabs, a trace upon a lace handkerchief. Even among the wealthy, to smell too strongly was considered vulgar. For everyone else, simpler forms of scent were favored. Powders, for example, fine starch or ground rice flour. These powders were applied with puffs or cloths, dusted across the body after bathing. They kept the skin dry. A small tin of powder might sit atop a bedroom dresser. Not flashy, but if opened, it would release the faintest sigh of sweetness, a whisper of something gentle. A woman might dust her underarms. A man might use it across his chest or back, especially in summer. It was practical, but it was also comforting. There were also scented waters, floral infusions kept in glass bottles, homemade or purchased. Rose water, for example, was used not just in cooking, but as a skin rinse. A small splash on a cloth, wiped gently across the face. Lavender water might be added to a basin before a wash. Eau de cologne, often much simpler than today's versions, was sometimes diluted with spirits and used on the hands, the wrists, or the nape of the neck to refresh one's clothing. Sachets, small pouches filled with dried herbs or petals. The most common included lavender, mint, thyme. A few added lemon peel or cloves. The scent, absorbed into linens, offered a trace of freshness, even after many days of wear. These sachets were sewn by hand. Handkerchiefs, too, were often scented. A lady might keep one in her sleeve or purse, occasionally bringing it to her nose as a polite gesture. Though also, at times, to block out the more pervasive odors of the street, perfumed handkerchiefs served a purpose beyond etiquette. They were shields, and while perfumes in the traditional sense were used sparingly, the sense of cleanliness were achieved through layering. A sprig of rosemary in the wash water, a puff of violet powder, the absence of body odor, carefully masked, not covered up. The importance of fragrance also reached into how homes themselves were cared for. Rooms were aired daily, even in winter, windows cracked open, curtains pulled aside. In wealthier homes, rose petals or orange peels might be simmered in water upon the stove. In simpler homes, clean rushes were laid on the floor. All of it was subtle. All of it signaled effort. There were those who could not afford such things. For them, cleanliness was measured in absence, the absence of visible dirt. They relied on sun-dried clothing, on brushing and wiping the body, on drying the feet carefully at the end of the day. But even they, when they could, made their own scented oils, infused vinegar, steeped herbs, and tried, in their way, to keep a sense of dignity. The idea of clean in the Victorian mind was not just visual. It was olfactory and moral. A clean person was not simply one without soil on their clothes, but one whose scent suggested order, calm, and control over the body, over the home, over one's place in the world. By the end of the evening, the powders are put away, the sachets return to their drawers, a comb is passed once more through hair that smells of lavender water. The bed sheets, still crisp from the wash, carry their own faint perfume, and the room settles. The body is not sterile, not scrubbed raw, but clean by the quiet standards of the time. And in that softness, in that intention, let yourself imagine it now. A bed dressed in line-dried linen, a single candle flickering in a brass holder, a breath of violet in the air, and the hush of a home at rest. Let it carry you softly to sleep, if it wishes, or hold you gently as you listen. Picture a quiet patch of ground, a small city garden, an empty corner behind a tenement, or the dirt, but beneath the topsoil lie fragments. These are the relics of hygiene, the material echoes of how people once cleaned. In the past century, archaeological digs in cities like London, Manchester, and Edinburgh have slowly revealed a hidden layer of Victorian life. Not through palaces or treasures, through water tanks, through wash tubs, and soap shards, and broken perfume bottles. The infrastructure of cleanliness, preserved in clay and rust and bone. Among the most frequently discovered remains are those of communal washhouses, buried where old slums once stood, foundations, bricks, still blackened with soot, outline rooms where dozens of women once gathered on Mondays to scrub. The floors are grooved. In the corners, iron drainage pipes once carried away soapy water. Nearby archaeologists sometimes find remains of the fireboxes, though time has collapsed these rooms into soil. The stories they tell are vivid. Fragments of old flannels, a child's shirt collar, soap shards, still faintly scented, with carbolic or rosemary, all speak to a world where cleanliness was communal, where water and heat were shared. Sifting through these layers, researchers also find evidence of early plumbing systems. Clay pipes snake across the ground. Others carry traces of waste, not always pleasant to uncover, but essential for understanding. The mineral buildup inside these ancient drains tells us what people poured away. The archaeology of hygiene is often invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the senses. Sometimes entire bathhouses are uncovered, one beneath a school in Leeds, another beneath a demolished housing block in Birmingham. These discoveries show how neighborhoods once functioned, how the poor organized themselves around shared resources. Some had bath tokens, thin brass discs used to purchase entry, later found in the pockets of forgotten coats. Others left behind signs and placards. No spitting, hot water by appointment only. Tools of hygiene appear, too. Iron soap holders, glass jars etched with lavender pomade, pieces of wooden combs, the occasional scorched corner of a towel, where it had come too close to the fire. Even small perfume bottles, some cracked, others intact, containing hardened, discolored oil once meant for the skin. And perhaps most poignantly, archaeologists find evidence of care among the ordinary. A woman's bonnet, a child's tin bath toy, shaped like a boat, pulled from the debris near a communal wash trough, a shard of hand mirror glass. These weren't just objects. They were part of rituals, part of lives shaped around soap and steam, order and effort. Sometimes it's not what is found, but where. For example, it was common to dispose of old personal items in these pits, when they were eventually sealed. As a result, layers of soot, toothbrush handles carved from bone, small ceramic cups, bits of flannel cloth wrapped around oil bottles to prevent leaking. These privies reveal as much about social norms as they do about sanitation. The further back you dig, but moving into the later Victorian years, archaeologists begin to see refinement. Mass-produced hygiene goods, labels, packaging, a sense that cleanliness was not only a private matter, but a cultural expectation. Museums across the UK now quietly display these finds, not under spotlights. Soap dish. See, fragment of flannel. These small items sit quietly, overlooked by many, but rich in implication. They tell us that hygiene was not an abstract idea. It was real, heavy, textured, rooted in labor and habit. It left behind not only cleaner skin, grooves worn into scrub boards. These discoveries remind us of something important. That history is not only made in grand halls or battlefields, but in basins, in bathtubs, in Monday washrooms filled with rising steam and the soft slosh of water. Close your eyes now. Picture those walls, crumbled but proud. Picture the ghost. Picture a woman kneeling with her sleeves rolled up, rubbing at a collar, humming softly, unaware that over a century later, her work would be remembered, not in books, but in the dirt beneath our feet. Let that image settle in your mind. Let it hold you in the rhythm of slow, ordinary care. The gentle art of instruction, hygiene manuals and etiquette books. The bathhouses are gone now, folded back into the earth. The pipes rust in silence. But above ground, in libraries, attics, and dusty shelves, another kind of hygiene artifact remains, not made of metal or soap, but of paper. Books, slim, often hand-sized volumes, published in the tens of thousands throughout the 19th century. These were not books of poetry or fiction. Though some were penned with a careful hand, they were manuals, guides, companions to the quiet, everyday rituals of cleanliness. Victorian hygiene advice came wrapped in gentility. It was not barked or dictated. The tone was calm, even when dealing with matters of grime. The words tiptoed carefully, as if not to ruffle the sensibilities of the reader. A popular title was The Lady's Guide to Perfect Gentility. It spoke softly of personal upkeep, recommending that a well-bred lady and hands with cold water each morning and evening. Being careful to dry thoroughly, the language is gentle. The advice measured. For the breath, a rinse of rose water and clove. Cleanliness, the book insists, is the truest ornament. Another, hints on health and clean habits, offered more practical guidance. In it, the writer advises that linen worn against the skin should be changed at least twice a week, for the accumulation of perspiration breeds unwholesomeness. The sentence is simple, quietly authoritative, only suggestion. Etiquette manuals, of which there were many, often wove hygiene into broader themes of behavior. A young man was encouraged not just to wash, but to do so without drawing attention. Public grooming was frowned upon. Toothpicks used in company were a mark of poor breeding. A gentleman should excuse himself discreetly. If a matter of personal discomfort arose, even scratching one's head was advised against. The young lady's book of elegant conduct included an entire chapter on morning routine. It began with a passage on posture, followed by instructions for brushing the teeth, caring for the nails, and washing the neck and ears. Makeup, of course, was discouraged. A sign of vanity, unbecoming the fairer sex. Instead, the glow of good hygiene was preferred, a natural bloom fostered by diligence and purity. There were books for mothers, too, advising them on how to teach children the habits of cleanliness. These emphasized repetition, routine, and gentle correction. A child should be taught to wash their hands before meals, to brush the teeth with soot, to wear clean underlinen. Cleanliness, the manuals repeated again and again, was a sign of order, and order was a reflection of character. Not all books were so formal. Some were pamphlets, distributed by health societies or religious charities. These spoke in plain language, often to working-class readers. Boil your water. One pamphlet read, "Scrub your floors with soap and sand." These leaflets offered instructions for making lye from ashes. They were designed not to instruct with elegance, but to equip two-arm households with the basics of sanitation, often in the face of disease, and disease was always nearby. The shadow of cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, these loomed large in Victorian cities. Some books treated them as medical matters, others as moral. To be clean was not only to avoid illness. This belief shaped the advice. Cleanliness became a visible signal of inner discipline. Even novels of the time reinforced this. Characters described as slovenly were never heroic. A clean apron, a neat collar, a polished boot. These were signs of industry and respectability. A gentleman's cuffs might be worn, but if they were clean, he retained dignity. A child with a washed face might still be poor, but she was not degraded. Shame was implied, not pronounced, but it hovered. A lady who smelled of perspiration was neglectful. A man with oily hair was unkempt, and worse. It is interesting to note how hygiene advice intersected with architecture. As homes grew more complex, the literature adapted. Some manuals from the 1890s advised on how to maintain a water closet, how often to scrub, what disinfectants to use, how to ensure proper ventilation. Others detailed the placement of the washstand in a bedroom, ideally near a window for light, but not so near as to catch a chill. And throughout there was the language of modesty. No part of the body was named directly if it could be avoided. The underarms were referred to as the parts where perspiration most accumulates. Feet were the extremity. Hairbrushes were to be cleaned weekly, but specifics were often left out. Yet within all these courtesies and evasions, these manuals were not written to control, but to soothe, to help the reader feel prepared, equipped, capable of facing the world with quiet, confidence, and for those who read them, often by candlelight, perhaps while seated beside a softly steaming basin, they offered more than advice. They offered order. You can imagine the pages now. Thin, faintly yellowed, a pressed flower used as a bookmark, a handwritten note in the margin. Try lavender water next week. A history not just of what people did, but how they learned to do it. Softly, repeatedly, quietly. Let that linger with you now. The thought of those books, their gentle tone, their careful guidance, cleanliness, and folk belief. In the Victorian era, the basin is still warm. The towel is hung neatly over a chair. The books and pamphlets lie closed now, tucked beside the bed or returned to the shelf. The instructions they carried, so gentle, so particular, might have guided the hands. But for many in Victorian England, there was another layer to the act of washing, one not written in manuals or spoken of in polite conversation. A quieter tradition. Many Victorians still held close to folk beliefs, inherited customs, whispered advice, and small rituals carried through generations. These were not always logical, not always seen as practical, but they gave shape to the unknown. And when it came to hygiene, they played a subtle, persistent role. Consider the morning wash. A child might be taught not just to wash the face and hands, but to do so in a particular order. Always right hand first. Left might bring bad luck. Or, in some households, the day's wash water was not to be thrown out until after the midday meal. To spill it too early was to invite loss. In other homes, the first wash water of the year was used to rinse the threshold of the home, said to keep misfortune away for the months to come. Salt played a central role. It was considered purifying. A pinch might be added to the bath water of a newborn. A handful scattered across the doorstep after someone sick had left the house. Laundresses might toss a spoonful into the final rinse of bedding used by a fevered child. Not because it cleaned more thoroughly, but because it calmed the spirit. Salt was a symbol of protection, and soap. Some believed that bathing with soap boiled on a new moon brought clarity of thought. Others insisted that soap must never be given as a gift, lest it wash away friendship. There were those who swore by specific soaps for specific ailments. Yellow soap for bruises, brown soap for sorrow, lavender soap to ward off nightmares. None of it proved, of course, but carefully passed from hand to hand. Quietly believed. Tooth care too had its share of ritual, beyond soot and chalk. An old rhyme was sometimes repeated as one brushed. Brush with care and whisper thrice. But in the flickering light of a single candle, in a mirror slightly warped by age, such rituals grounded the mind. They made routine into something comforting. Hair care was especially charged with meaning. Hair held power symbolically and spiritually. To wash it too often was believed by some to drain vitality. To cut it during a waning moon might bring thinning or early grey. To burn the hair trimmings. The hearth fire consumed such things in silence. One might not dry baby clothes at night. A sock placed beneath a pillow could ease aching feet. A shirt turned inside out before washing might ward off misfortune. Washing women's underclothes with those of men in the same basin was frowned upon in some regions, not only for modesty, but due to belief in disrupting the household's harmony. Water itself, so often assumed to be neutral, was layered with meaning. Spring water, drawn before sunrise, was considered especially potent for cleansing the soul. Rainwater collected on the first day of May could be used to bathe the face for beauty. Water left sitting overnight, however, might be tainted by spirit. It was best to empty the basin before sleep. And there was silence, too. A belief that washing should be done in quiet. That laughter or argument while bathing could attract bad luck. Many homes treated the early morning or evening wash as a time of near ritual, done slowly, with care, without noise. It created a kind of boundary around the act, a frame that held the moment apart from the rest of the day. Not all believed these things. Some scoffed, others kept them privately. But across the countryside, these folk beliefs were woven into everyday hygiene. They did not replace the soap or the scrub brush. They lived alongside them, and in many ways they served the same purpose: to give control over a chaotic world. Disease, decay, misfortune, these loomed constantly, especially in the crowded, dirty corners of Victorian life. Cleanliness, whether guided by science or superstition, became a way to push back, to hold a small, bright line between self and sorrow. Close your eyes now and picture it. A woman pouring salt into a basin with her back to the window. A child brushing teeth while humming a rhyme learned from his grandmother. A man drying his hands quietly, not speaking, believing the silence holds peace. These are moments unrecorded in textbooks. But they are real. They were lived. Let that stillness fill your mind. The scents, the soft superstitions folded into linen and soap, surgery, and the scent of sterility, hygiene and the medical awakening. Imagine now a room not lit by candles, a room not filled with perfume or powder, but with the sharp taps of carbolic acid, faintly metallic, crisp as rain on stone, the sound of water trickling. You are in a hospital, or perhaps, more precisely, in the early Victorian period, hospitals were not necessarily places to heal. Often they were last resorts, places of last hope or last rites. Infection ran unchecked. Surgeons operated with unwashed hands. Instruments were wiped on aprons or rinsed in cold water. Patients entered with injuries and left. If they left at all, with fevers that had no name yet. Death was not uncommon, nor was decay. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the revolution did not begin with a bang. It began with observations, and among the earliest and quietest of those observers was a woman, Florence Nightingale. She arrived in Crimea in the 1850s, to a military hospital where wounded soldiers lay in filth. The air was thick. The bedding was stained. She didn't begin with medicines. She began with mops, with soap, with fresh air. Her interventions were simple: clean bandages, boiled linens, ventilation. But the impact was extraordinary. And with each death prevented, a new idea took root. That cleanliness. Back in England, her influence spread. The idea of the nurse shifted from passive caregiver to active guardian of hygiene. Training schools were opened. Hospitals began to organize more carefully. Beds spaced wider, windows unshuttered, floors scrubbed, doctors trained in tradition. Many believed that disease arose from miasma, bad air, not bad germs. Washing hands between patients was not yet common. Surgical instruments were still reused without sterilization. And then came Joseph Lister. He watched quietly. The operations themselves were successful. The cuts clean, the wounds stitched, but the aftermath was often fatal. Lister had read of Louis Pasteur's work on germs, invisible yet potent. He decided to act. In the 1860s, Lister began treating surgical instruments, wounds, and even the air itself with carbolic acid, a sharp, stinging antiseptic. He washed his hands. He cleaned incisions. He soaked dressings. At first, colleagues scoffed. But his success could not be ignored. Wounds healed. Fever declined. Survival became expectation. Hospitals changed again. Walls were whitewashed. Not to brighten, uniforms standardized. Nurses instructed to wash not only their hands, but every surface they touched. The scent of bleach and carbolic became the signature of healing spaces. For the first time, cleanliness became institutional. It reached beyond hospitals, into schools, prisons, workhouses. Children were taught to wash hands before meals, not just to appear well-mannered, but to prevent illness. Public health campaigns, often illustrated with soft, firm images, encouraged families to boil water, clean wounds, avoid spoiled milk. Soap became more affordable, advertised. Its scent became aspirational. There were posters quietly pinned to tenement walls. Clean hands save lives. Leaflets slipped into grocery bags. Boil linens after illness. Simple in the dissecting rooms, those quiet clinical spaces where anatomy was studied. Changes came to. No longer was the human body approached with callousness. Gloves appeared. The room became less cold, but cleaner. Always cleaner. Death did not disappear. Disease remained, but by soap and boiling water, and hands washed again. Imagine now the surgeon. The bristles of the brush scrape gently against knuckles. The scent of carbolic rises like steam. His gown is stiff, his breath steady, and think of the patient, no longer terrified. The smell of fresh linen, the quiet creak of the door. The nurse enters, hands folded, apron clean. She checks the temperature, adjusts the blanket, whispers nothing at all. These are the quiet triumphs of Victorian hygiene. In water buckets, in soap dishes and cotton wraps, the era did not end with fanfare. But by its close, cleanliness had become expectation, not superstition. The transformation to care, drawing rooms, decanters, and delicacy. Hygiene among the Victorian elite. We step now into quieter halls, into thickly carpeted parlors and gaslit sitting rooms, into homes where the scent of coal smoke was masked by cut flowers, and where silence was not the absence of noise. This is the world of the Victorian upper class, a world far removed from the public washhouses, the shared basins, and the Monday laundry ritual. Here, it was a performance. In such homes, bathing was often an event of its own, not daily, but formal, often scheduled, and always managed. Imagine the bath. Not tin. It stood often freestanding, windows shuttered. The bath itself filled by servants who brought hot water from the kitchen in copper pails, then cooled it as requested. The lady of the house did not fetch her own towel, nor did she scrub her own back. A lady's maid assisted. Scented water was added to the bath, rose, neroli, or even pine. A bar of soap. The bath was short, private, and always followed by fresh linen undergarments, embroidered with initials, starched, pressed. For the gentleman, the morning routine was equally deliberate. A valet prepared the shaving water, laid out the combs and brushes, the linen collar and cravat. Scents were chosen with care. Not heavy colognes, but subtle bay rum, lavender, or sandalwood. The appearance of effortlessness. And those who noticed it, beyond the personal rituals, the smell of beeswax on polished floors was a kind of welcome. Parlors were dusted twice daily, curtains beaten and aired. Servants, often invisible to guests, moved through the home with quiet efficiency, ensuring that no scent, no speck of ash, disturbed the carefully maintained atmosphere. Cleanliness here was not the triumph of effort, as it was in poorer households. It was the triumph of delegation. In the dining room, hygiene took another form. Ritualized manners. Hands were always washed before meals, of course. But beyond that, there was the care of cutlery, the shine of silver, the spotless table linen. Water glasses were rinsed and polished, plates warmed. A crumb fallen on the cloth was lifted gently. The servant refilled the wine decanter with steady hands, never touching lip to lip. And then the guests, equally rehearsed in their role, napkins unfolded and placed, the body controlled, gestures soft. Cleanliness here was not just physical, it was behavioral, a performance of refinement. Guests might excuse themselves between courses, but to repowder the face, to adjust the lace cuff, to rinse the hands in scented water. These side rooms were sometimes equipped with wash basins made of marble or ceramic, elaborate in design, but rarely used for anything so practical as scrubbing. They were symbols, mostly appearances. Bedrooms in these homes told similar stories. The ladies' dressing table was a kingdom of porcelain, crystal and gold, brushes lined in ivory, bottles of scent with etched silver stoppers. Each item had a place, a purpose. A maid kept the table spotless, though her own quarters lacked even a mirror. Linens were changed frequently, not always because they were soiled, but because freshness was a standard. Beds were remade every morning, air refreshed with lemon peel or rose water spritzed from atomized. The lady of the house might never see the labor, but she would notice its absence. Of course, even here, beneath the layers of elegance, illness lurked. Typhoid visited even the wealthy. Colds turned to pneumonia. But disease among the upper class was treated differently. Private physicians were summoned. Rooms were kept warm. Servants instructed to sterilize handkerchiefs with steam. Cleanliness was marshaled as defense, as if good taste could keep contagion at bay. And though the house gleamed, the labor behind it remained hidden. The laundry still boiled far below. The soap still stung someone's hands. The floors, polished to brilliance, were walked by booted maids before they ever saw the feet of guests. Yet to the visitors, listening to the soft clink of the spoon, cleanliness, it was style, status, the absence, too, of struggle. Now let yourself rest in that image. A candle flickering near a marble basin, a towel monogrammed and folded, a window just slightly ajar, letting in the faintest breeze. All is still. All is ordered. Hygiene and the domestic servants whirled while the drawing rooms shimmered with polish and the bathtubs gleamed with porcelain grace. A very different world carried the weight of that elegance. Below stairs or down the hall, servants lived another rhythm, a rhythm built not on comfort, but on labor, on routine. For them, cleanliness was not a luxury or a performance. It was duty, relentless and often invisible. The day for a servant, long before the first bell summoned tea, long before boots were set by the door to be polished, it was done in silence. Ash from the night before was gently scooped out, carried carefully so as not to leave a trace on the rug or hearth. Kindling positioned with care, a fire coaxed to life. Not for warmth, but for the comfort of others, with the hearth glowing. Dry dusting came first, then the damp cloth, boiled in water. Every surface touched, every mark, every trace of a finger or heel or handprint, quietly removed. Brass doorknobs were buffed with cloths, chandeliers wiped down, their crystals turned until they caught the gaslights. A housemaid might change the towels in each room daily, folded crisply, precisely, so that no crease was visible, if any bore signs of use. Cleanliness was not about appearances alone, about ensuring no guest ever felt the absence of fresh water, warm linen, or a spotless glass. These tasks were expected, taken for granted, but the labor behind them was considerable. The housemaid's own hygiene, meanwhile, was managed in snatches of time. They shared cramped quarters, often in attic rooms, often cold. A shared basin might be their only means to wash. Water had to be carried up, heated with care, shared again. No scented soap. A single bar might last a month, scraped down 2 slivers and stitched into muslin to extend its use. Hair was brushed nightly. Feet were soaked when they ached, but not too often, lest the hot water be missed in the morning. Clothes were mended, undergarments hand-washed and strung discreetly to dry in corners, near the fire if possible. Still, pride was taken. Clean aprons, white collars, polished boots. These were not only for show, they were badges of diligence. A maid arriving for her post, with unkempt appearance, risked not just her position, but her reputation, in a world where references meant everything. The male servants, their uniforms had to be immaculate, their hands clean, even after laboring with coal or horses. Some kept lemon slices to rub away stains. Others scraped their nails with bone tools, dipped their hands in vinegar water to remove smells. Not because they were vain, yet perhaps the most constant companion in these servants' lives was water. Cold, hauled in buckets, dirty, emptied from basins. Clean water boiled for tea. It soaked their hands, chilled their fingers. Bathrooms for the servants were rare, if they existed at all. Instead, a basin in the kitchen, the same cloth, sometimes used for scrubbing a pot. In the best households, separate supplies were designated. In others, necessity blurred the lines. And yet, despite the strain, the relentless repetition, they braided their hair with care. They brushed their teeth with homemade powders. They tucked sachets of dried herbs into their drawers. Small islands of control in long days, governed by others' comfort. There were superstitions here too. A maid might spit on a scrub brush before tackling a tough stain. A holdover from her mother or grandmother, or she might turn her boots to face the wall at night, believing it kept her from bringing the household's troubles to bed. Tiny rituals, tiny comforts, and all the while, the household above floated on the surface. The dinners served, the guests received, the rooms lit, the flowers fresh, as if by magic, but the hands behind that magic were sore, the backs bent, the breath sometimes shallow from dust or steam. Now imagine them, at the end of the day, the last curtain drawn, a housemaid, finally seated, unlacing her boots in the dimness of her own room. Her hands smell faintly of starch and iron polish. She wipes her brow, brushes her skirt, and reaches, maybe, for a basin of water, still warm from the stove, to rinse the day from her skin. A personal ritual. Cleanliness, even in service, had meaning, had comfort, had dignity. Let that settle with you now. The sound of the scrub brush, the clink of iron on tile, the rustle of cloth. Public hygiene in urban Victorian life. The great homes faded. The servants have folded their cloths, lowered their eyes, and stepped back into shadow. But outside the cobbled streets, beneath the coal street skies, another world continued to breathe. One filled not with luxury, but with crowds, with the ceaseless churn of city life. Victorian cities were vast and growing, pulling people in faster than they could build for them. London, Manchester, Birmingham, these names conjured soot, industry, and fog, but they also held something less visible, the daily, delicate struggle to remain clean in a world that rarely allowed for it. In the poorest quarters of these cities, hygiene was not absent but rather constrained, shaped by availability, by cost, by time. Families shared rooms, often entire households to a floor. There might be one tap in the yard. Water came cold, scarce, sometimes frozen in winter, or foul in summer. Still, they used it. Still, they cleaned. Public washhouses, those sober brick buildings built by local councils or philanthropists. Inside, the air was thick with steam and the temps of soap. Copper tubs lined the walls. Boards for scrubbing. Boilers rumbling softly in the corners. People arrived early. Nor you. Time was limited. Children waited quietly. These spaces weren't comfortable, but they offered, for a few pence, the chance to scrub away a week's labor, the chance to soak aching feet, to wash a baby, to feel, briefly, human again. There were also public baths, fewer, and often reserved for men. Some charged a small fee, others were subsidized by city funds. They were simple stone rooms, wooden benches, basins, chained to the walls. One might bathe alone. There was privacy, of a sort, and for those who had only tin pails and Baccali water at home, these were havens. Yet despite the effort people made to stay clean, dirtiness was not simply a condition, it became a label. To be unwashed was not just to be tired, or poor, it was to be deemed less respectable, less moral. less safe. This association ran deep. Newspapers spoke of filthy neighborhoods, equating disease not with access, but with character. Charity reports, health inspectors sometimes described entire streets as beyond redemption, and those who lived in these places, the shame of being seen before the wash, the sidelong glance when their collars were frayed, the silent distance kept by others when their boots carried too much of the street. Still, within these neighborhoods, soap stretched with ashes, children's hands wiped clean with damp claws, boys scrubbing boots before dinner. They taught their children to do the same. Some local shops sold scented powders by the ounce, affordable, faint, but enough to mask the worst of the day. A bar of soap might be cut into pieces and shared among neighbors, towels mended over and over again, and always the hope of clean linen for Sunday. Public toilets were few. Those that did exist were often segregated by class, some built for gentlemen. For many women, the streets posed a challenge not just of space. Relief, when needed, might be sought in alleyways, behind market stalls, in the corners of yards, and always with fear of shame. The reformers came with good intentions and stiff manners. They spoke of sanitation, of moral uplift, of cleanliness. They built bathhouses, but few truly understood between warmth and soap. Even so, change began. Slowly, pipes laid under streets, pumps repaired, washhouses expanded, children sent home from school for lice or dirt were sometimes offered baths instead of punishment. The idea began to take hold that society, if it expected cleanliness, let us pause here. Imagine now the woman walking home from the washhouse. Her hands are red from the scrubbing, her arms tired, but her basket is full of fresh-smelling linen, and she walks straighter, not proudly, at peace, for now, with the work she has done. She passes a baker's window. Children gather around her. The scent of soap still lingers in the folds of her skirt. The sky is dimming. Lamps are being lit. But inside her home, she knows the water will be warm. The children will be washed. And tomorrow, she will begin again. Let that image carry you. The legacy of Victorian hygiene as the final decades of the 19th century slowly curled into the early 20th. Much had changed. Pipes hummed beneath cobbled streets. Gaslights flickered behind frosted glass. Soap advertisements adorned the pages of every paper. Cleanliness, a standard, but the meaning of clean had also evolved. It was no longer just the absence of visible dirt, a social marker, a way of separating not just classes, but character. And in this way, hygiene had become more than personal, it had become cultural. By the 1880s and 1890s, bathrooms were appearing in more middle-class homes. Not yet in every flat or tenement, but in terraced houses, in suburban villas, in homes just new enough to boast running water and glazed tiles, a small room, a water closet with a polished wooden lid, perhaps even a claw-footed tub, pale and deep, beneath a tall, misty window. These bathrooms, no longer did water need to be hauled up in pails. No longer did families have to scrub their skin beside a stove. Now, hygiene could be private. regular, even comfortable. The soaps, too, had changed. No longer harsh grey blocks from homemade lye. By the century's end, pears, soap, sunlight. Women smiled from billboards with shining hair and flawless skin. A clean child was a happy child. A clean home, a moral one. And the magazines spoke to the ladies' realm. Good housekeeping, they offered columns on the best brushes for each surface, advice on mouthwashes, on skin creams, on avoiding the faint odors that came from damp towels or mildewed boots. To smell clean was to be clean. Schools introduced hygiene lessons. Children lined up for inspection nails checked. Health visitors began to enter homes, offering advice, sometimes unsolicited, sometimes unwelcome. They brought soap samples, checked the water closets, noted the condition of bed. It was help, yes, but it also came with judgment. The divide between clean and unclean was now watched, measured, yet even as the standards rose, the means remained unequal. Many still lived in dwellings. Many still walked the public washhouse, still scrubbed at shared taps. The rhetoric of cleanliness did not always match the reality of access, and the shame of failing to meet these standards lasting. There were also those who resisted, writers like George Gissing or Charles Booth. They showed that unwashed skin did not mean unworthy, that dignity could live beside hardship, that the pursuit of cleanliness was noble but only when possible. Still, the Victorian ideal persisted. It hardened. It passed from generation to generation, and perhaps most telling of all was the final resting place of this. By 1900, the bathroom had become a sanctuary, a retreat, a place where one could lock the door and be alone with water and warmth, with a mirror, with quiet. No servants, no audiences, just steam and stillness. The tiled walls bore no paintings, but they gleamed. The taps, though slow, sang a quiet song, the soap fragrant. And in this space, the Victorian age finally came to rest not in war, nor empire, nor invention, but in ritual, in the gentle daily act of washing. Imagine it now. You enter such a room late at night. The lamp is low. The porcelain sink is cold beneath your fingertips. You turn the tap. You hold your hands beneath it. The warmth spreads slowly through your palms. You reach for the soap round, smooth, familiar. You lather. The fog rolls in. But here, in this moment, you are clean, not just in body, but in mind, in memory. Cleanliness as virtue and identity. In the Victorian mind, welcome to the final stretch of our journey. We've walked the gaslit streets. We've drawn water from iron pumps. We've stood in tiled bathrooms. But now we pause and look deeper, beyond the soap and sponge, past the towel and tiled floor and into the soul of the Victorian era, into what cleanliness truly meant. Because for Victorians, about how one was perceived by others and how one saw oneself. It was the wrapping paper of morality, a polished exterior. Throughout the century, cleanliness is next to godliness. The preacher would intone, Dirty hands weren't just a sign of labor, they were a sign, perhaps, of a dirty heart. A clean apron whispered of modesty, restraint, self-control. This belief went hand in hand with another condition of the mind and soul. Disorder on the outside hinted at disorder within. So clothes were mended, faces scrubbed, not only for health, but to show respectability, to announce silently, "I am a person of order." This ideal extended far beyond the parlors and it became a lens through which Victorians saw the world and each other. The working class was often depicted in literature and press as unwashed, not merely because they lacked plumbing. It was easier for the powerful to believe that poverty came from laziness than misfortune. And dirt, visible and undeniable, became the evidence they used. So charitable societies sprang up, preaching not just the gospel of God, but the gospel of soap. Missionaries offered religious tracts alongside wash basins. Girls' homes, boys were taught to brush their teeth and comb their hair, not for their comfort. Even immigrants and the colonized were judged through this same lens. Cleanliness became a yardstick used to measure civilization, and by this metric, the British Empire often deemed itself it's a troubling echo one, where hygiene quietly fed into hierarchy, and the scrubbed hand came to symbolize more than personal care. It became justification at home. Meanwhile, within families, cleanliness was also bound up with gender. Women were expected to embody purity, to keep house, to bear the scent of lavender or violet, never sweat or labor. Girls were scolded not for roughness, but for untidiness. A torn stocking, a stained skirt, and yet women also bore the weight of maintaining this ideal for others. They washed, they ironed, they disinfected, not just their own clothing and bedding, but their husbands, their children's, and sometimes their employers. Their work was largely unseen, but if it lapsed, it was noticed immediately. To be clean, in the Victorian mind, was also to be normal. Deviance was spotted not just in behavior, but in appearance. Mental illness, criminality, even melancholy, these were often interpreted through the state of one's body. A man who neglected to shave, who wandered with stains on his coat, might be assumed unstable. A woman whose hair was not brushed might be seen as hysterical. In this way, cleanliness became a social currency, a protective shield, a passport into civility. If you were clean, you might not be wealthy, but you were seen as worthy. And yet, behind this moral armor, a mother wiping her child's hands after supper, a man washing behind his ears before lighting the lamp, a girl dipping her toes into a cold stream on a summer morning. These moments existed too, quietly, apart from judgment, apart from shame. These were acts not of display, but of care, of calm. Even now, in our modern world of hot showers and scented soaps, we echo them. The towel laid out the night before, the quiet ritual of brushing teeth, the comfort of clean sheets. Victorian cleanliness may have become performance, but it began and ended in care. So now, breathe slowly. Picture a basin. Nor you, picture the hands that laid it out. and picture your own hands resting gently on its soft surface. The past lives here, too. The aesthetic of cleanliness in the Victorian home picture, now a modest parlor. The light is subdued, filtering in through lace-curtained windows. The wallpaper, high shelf holding porcelain ornaments. Below, the carpet is brushed, the hearth swept, the fender polished to a muted gleam. Everything in its place. Not extravagant, but careful, deliberate. This is the Victorian home, not merely a shelter, but a carefully composed portrait of respectability. And at its heart was not wealth, nor fashion. At its heart, by the mid-19th century, the interior of the home had become an extension of moral philosophy. A clean home was thought to reflect a clean mind. A well-kept sitting room whispered of industriousness. Clutter, dust, disordered ease were more than aesthetic failings. They were lapses in character. And so, the arrangement of furniture, the texture of the curtains, the shine on the doorknobs all. Let us begin with the washstand, found in many bedrooms. It often stood quietly in the corner, beneath a mirror. A pitcher often, ceramic or enamel, rested in a matching basin. A bar of soap. Each morning the ritual repeated. Sometimes the water was cold, sometimes warmed if the household had the means. But the stand itself was not merely practical. It was symbolic. Its presence told visitors and family alike that this was a home of order, of routine. Elsewhere, every surface played its part. Tables were draped in clean linen cloths, often starched and smoothed by hand. Windows were washed weekly. Curtains, though heavy with velvet or damask, and floors, whether carpeted or boarded, were swept each morning, often by hand. The air inside was equally managed. Coal smoke, ever present from the street and hearth, was countered with gentle scents. Lavender sachets, lemon peel left to dry near the windowsill. In wealthier homes, atomizers sprayed rose water across upholstery. In simpler homes, the scent of soap lingered on freshly washed linen, enough to announce cleanliness. With subtlety, even the arrangement of objects reflected this mindset. Ornaments were not merely a well-dusted figurine or polished mantel clock said, "Someone cares here. Someone notices." Family photographs in oval frames, small collections of seashells or miniature books, each placed with care, dusted with vigilance. And then, of course, the bathroom, when it existed, was the shrine of this aesthetic. Clawfoot tubs stood proud, taps shone. Towels were not merely folded, mirrors were wiped clean of streaks, and the tile, often white or pale blue, was chosen precisely because it showed every speck. It was not a forgiving, that was the point. Even in homes, simpler households emulated what they could. Clean rag rugs, homemade linen curtains, makeshift washstand. The goal was not opulence. Cleanliness was democratic. It could be pursued even in hardship, and often was. These interiors were not static. They breathed. They changed with the seasons. Spring cleaning, a term born in this era, was not merely tidying, it was renewal. Rugs beaten in the yard, chimneys swept. It was an act, both practical and spiritual, a cleansing of the space. a restart for the soul, and the act of cleaning itself became woven into daily life. It was rhythmic. Wednesday for mending, Saturday for preparation. In this way, even the presence of visitors influenced the domestic stage. A clean doorstep welcomed more than shoes. It said, "This is a home of order." The umbrella stand was emptied. The hall mirror was shined. Cleanliness welcomed not just guests but respect, reputation, even opportunity. Yet, it's important to note that this was not always effortless. Behind these tidy spaces were the hands of women often unnoticed, learning how to starch collars or iron cuffs without creasing the seams. They worked in silence, but their labor spoke volumes. And so, when we admire the photographs of Victorian interiorista, the polished silver, the dainty fern in its porcelain pot, we are not simply seeing a moment in time. We are seeing a philosophy made tangible. We are seeing an ideal dusted and folded and arranged until it gleamed. Take a moment now. Let your mind rest in that space, the soft hush of curtains swaying in the breeze, the slow tick of the clock on the mantel, the scent of soap and beeswax, faint but present. Everything in its place, everything cared for, not perfect, but clean, health, citizenship, and the soap-right nation. Hygiene as reform and identity. Let us now drift from parlors and private rooms and enter a broader world, a world of policy, public discourse. Because in the final decades of the Victorian era, cleanliness was no longer just a personal virtue or a domestic responsibility. It had become political. It had become national. It had become expected. By the mid-1800s, cities like London, the population had outgrown its infrastructure, and especially among children, was heartbreakingly common. But instead of addressing the systemic causes, underpaid labor, polluted, what many empower, but entire cities, public health became a Victorian obsession. The Sanitary Act of 1866. Local health boards were formed. Guidelines were written. Streets began to be washed. Tenement walls were scrubbed, whitewashed. This wasn't merely about stopping disease, it was about enforcing a moral and visual standard. Cleanliness became the language of the civilized city. There were campaigns to end open defecation, to enforce proper drainage, to require that new buildings include indoor plumbing. Public lavatories were introduced, slowly and often controversially. Some feared they would attract undesirables. Others worried about the idea of bodily function being acknowledged in any way, even discreetly. But, step by step, the infrastructure changed, and along with it, so did the expectations of what it meant to be a citizen. Posters went up in schools and libraries. Wash your hands before every meal. Pamphlets were handed out in churches. Soap, the first defense against sin and sickness. Lectures were given in working men's halls, instructing families how to bathe infants. It was during this time that organizations like the Ladies' Sanitary Association gained prominence, publishing guides, visiting homes, and offering advice. Their tone was gentle. They assumed ignorance, and often came with a quiet note of superiority. Still, for many families, these visits were their first formal instruction in personal hygiene. Soap, once homemade and coarse. Factories produced it by the ton. Companies advertised it, not just as cleaner, but as better, more moral, more civil. Pear's soap ran advertisements, comparing the white of its bars to the purity of the soul. The Sunlight Soap Company promoted its product with cheerful children and shining sinks. The message was clear. To be clean was to be modern. To be clean was to be good. This narrative had its uses. It promoted better health, reduced infant mortality, and made cities more livable. But it also had its shadows. Cleanliness became a standard by which society judged. The poor who could not afford soap were branded as unfit. Immigrants who followed different bathing rituals were considered backwards. Colonized peoples around the world were deemed unclean by British standards, subjected to civilizing campaigns that centered around soap, dress, and housing. This was the birth of hygiene as ideology. It crept into schools, into courtrooms, into hiring decisions and housing policies. A clean appearance was required for work, for respect, for survival, and for many, achieving that appearance was a constant, grueling effort. Still, in some corners, a different kind of hygiene. Reformers like Octavia Hill believed that cleanliness and beauty could uplift not through shame, but through support. She helped design housing with fresh air. Her work recognized that people did not need to be taught morality. They needed to be given the tools to thrive. Public health campaigns began to speak less of moral duty and more of shared benefit. The Health Visitors Act of 1907 allowed trained women to go not as scolds, but as educators. They taught about boiled water, ventilation, nutrition, and they listened. They heard stories of limited income, of crowded rooms, of shared beds. Slowly, the clean city, once a fantasy of marble and brass, was becoming a reality. By the century's end, a clean Britain was a strong Britain, and in homes across the country, children were learning to tie their hair back, scrub their hands. Now pause. Imagine a boy at the sink, a flannel cloth in hand. He washes behind his ears. Outside, the street is loud, but here, in this moment, is quiet, is peace, is care. And this, too, is hygiene, not punishment, but present. The flickering light, the clean hands that reach for a plate. Victorian hygiene and the present day. The gaslights have faded now. The soot has settled. The heavy drapes and lace-rimmed basins, the worn hearth brushes and copper kettles, they all belong to another time, but their echoes remain, softly humming beneath the surface of our modern routines. You may not see them, you may not think of them, but the world we move through is shaped by the rituals, beliefs, and standards that Victorians spent a century defining. You feel it, perhaps, when you step into your bathroom and turn the tap without thinking. The hiss of hot water, the steady stream. You reach for soap. You dry your hands. You look into a mirror. Simple, daily actions, yet we rarely pause to question them. Why we wash our hands before meals. Why we expect homes to smell clean. Why we judge the untidiness of a stranger's collar or fingernails. These ideas feel natural, automatic, but they were taught, reinforced. The Victorians, for all their contradictions, that a clean body reflected a disciplined mind, that a swept doorstep could keep away not just dirt. Today, we often resist those exact associations. We've learned to see the dangers in moralizing dirt, in judging poverty, yet the habits persist. You may find them in the folded towel on the hotel rack, in the white tiles of a kitchen back, in the soft scent of fabric softener that carries a memory of childhood. Cleanliness as comfort, as care, as control. When the world beyond feels chaotic, even advertising has not strayed far. The soap still promises purity. The disinfectant, the detergent still shows smiling children and crisp white sheets. It is a lineage unspoken, but powerful. Schools still teach hygiene, though now in the language of science, not sin. Health classes explain bacteria, viruses, immunity, but beneath the diagrams lingers something more cultural, the quiet expectation that clean is better, that clean is safe, and it is, in many ways. Sanitation has saved lives. Regular bathing, hand washing, access to plumbing, these things have transformed global health, but they have also become boundaries. Invisible fences between those who can access them and those who cannot. The echoes of Victorian judgment remain. The traveller who avoids a restroom that doesn't smell right. The landlord who equates clutter with unreliability. The employer who assesses a job applicant. It is inherited, but just as we inherit the habits, because at its heart, Victorian hygiene was about more than soap and water. It was about care, about the quiet belief that to tend to oneself, to wash, to tidy, to freshen a room was an act of self-respect, of humanity, and that remains true. Cleanliness may have been used as a tool of judgment, but it also offered moments of peace. A boy shining his boots before school, a girl brushing her hair before sleep. These are moments that have no audience, no reward, only presence. And perhaps tonight you too will feel it. When you brush your teeth, when you fold your towel, when you smooth your sheets before sleep, you may not think of history, you may not recall gaslight or corsets, but you are continuing a lineage of care, of ritual, of quiet dignity. The water still runs, the soap still lathers, the mirror still reflects, and through these gentle motions, the past lives on. So now, breathe in. Let the quiet settle. Let the weight of time fall gently away. Let the tap drip once, then stop. Let the towel hang motionless in the warm, still air. You are clean. You are calm. You are at rest. It's time to sleep. You've wandered through washhouses and water closets, through powdered rooms and polished boots, through whispers of lavender. You've met those who scrubbed, those who judged, and those who simply tried. And now, in the quiet, after all the soap and steam has settled, there is only stillness. The Victorian world, a collar pinned straight. These gestures were rarely remembered, yet they formed the rhythm of millions of lives. Cleanliness was not only cleanliness, it was order, it was routine, it was love in disguise. Even the most rigid rituals, the most exacting standards, held beneath them a hope that with enough effort, with enough polish, the world might be a little more bearable. And so we thank them not for perfection, but for perseverance, for the hands that worked, for the water that warmed, for the quiet pursuit of dignity. Tonight, you carry that story with you not as a burden, but as a lullaby. History is not just kings and wars. Sometimes it's the soft clink of porcelain, the worn handle of a mop, the steam curling up from a teacup in a tidy room. Let that comfort you now, and sleep well.